Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
It's our final week of Capital Outlook from here in Cheyenne. I'm Craig Blumenshine from Wyoming PBS, and there is a lot to unpack on tonight's show. Thank you very much for watching. First, we'll lead off with the discussion with Wyoming Governor Matt Mead. We'll talk about his role in diffusing the differences between the House and the Senate relative to education funding. Then we'll go right to an extension of the same discussion with the President of the Senate, Eli Bebout, and the Speaker of the House, Steve Harshman. Lots to talk about relative to education. Then we'll introduce to you Wyoming's new Secretary of State, Ed Buchanan. He's our Capital Outlook profile. We'll continue on with a discussion with the majority floor leaders of both the House and the Senate, Representative Dave Miller and Senator Drew Perkins. We'll talk to them not only about the education debate, but also about what their priorities are for the Wyoming legislature in the interim. And we'll finish with a discussion of the more conservative right in the Wyoming House with Representatives Bo Beitman and Representative Chuck Gray. All that's next on Capital Outlook, which begins now.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.
And as we begin our final Capital Outlook of the season, this is week 4, we're privileged to be joined again by Governor Matt Mead. Governor, welcome to Capital Outlook.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me on.
Lots going on this session, but before we get into this legislative session, the issues that I want to visit with you about, Governor, you and your family had an awful experience early Tuesday morning when the governor's residence was broken into. Are you all okay?
We are okay. You know, it was obviously unfortunate and scary. My wife and my son and I were in the residence when it took place. We have a new puppy as of April, and he's a great big dog, and he sort of alerted me to the problems because he was growling and barking like I hadn't seen him before, and so he started barking, and then I tried to calm him down. He was out in the living room, and then the fire alarm went off, and first responders came, and I you know, it's just I don't want to lose an opportunity to say, you know, how fortunate we are to have, you know, great fire people and law enforcement people, and appreciate the work they always do. I mean, this is a reminder of how valuable they are to everyone in Wyoming, and so, but none of us were harmed, and shook up, but not harmed. And so.
As I understand, it was a single male.
It was a single male, and
has motive been established, Governor?
No, it's not to my knowledge. Law enforcement's continuing their investigation. The Highway Patrol and DCI are looking at everything and being very thorough, as they should be, and so they will continue to work on that and you know, try to figure out all that happened and motive as well.
The gentleman's in custody, though.
The gentleman is in custody. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad everything turned out okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Now we'll get into the main reason that we're here. Governor, in your State of the State address, you said that the state should look to find savings in education, but should do nothing that lessens Wyoming's long-held view of the great value of education. Is this legislator getting there with that, in your opinion?
Well, it remains to be seen. I mean, you've got certainly a lot of differing opinions, and they haven't resolved that yet. But I'm fairly confident, and I even quoted in my State of the State a governor from long ago about the value of education. And I think that's certainly true today. You know, Endow doesn't work without a great education system. And so I think, I mean, it's at my peril, I'm guessing where they may come out. I think there will be some cuts in education, but not to a degree that it's going to hurt the opportunities for our kids in K through 12. Not to the degree that our teachers aren't going to feel like they're supported as they should be. But you know the differences between the House and the Senate. You know what happens every day I have meetings with the president and the speaker, and again this morning we usually do those 6:30 in the morning, and then throughout the day. I'm hopeful that today we may get.
Are you a mediator in a sense there? Because it seems to many that they are far apart in their views, not only how education should be maybe funded, but also then potential cuts.
Right.
What's your role? Give us some insight.
We on occasion I meet with them separately, and sometimes it's the three of us. And I think when it's the three of us, those meetings are most productive. And I try to be a mediator, but I remind them I have a point of view on this as well. So as they work out their differences, I will have a viewpoint on this as it comes to my desk. And they're putting in long hours. It's not for lack of effort. It's just some fundamental differences between the president and the speaker, and then so I do try to we've got to keep talking and we got to keep working through the process. They're running against a clock that is turning out to be very tough. They're well aware of that, but they talk not only with me together and separately, but they talk to each other, and so I remain hopeful that we're going to find a resolution in the next couple of days.
During this midweek reporting, it's been reported, and I want to ask you if it's accurate, that you have been bending towards the House position, that you aren't at all immune to this idea of earmarks for education. Is that an accurate statement, Governor?
Yeah, for example, on as we look at where our funding goes and say, and this is over simplistic, but if we currently have a model that is sending funding automatically somewhere that is not as needed as education, I think we ought to look at it. Earmarks as a concept, the legislature generally is reluctant to do that, but depending upon what it is, it provides some predictability. It also shows that as we come in here next year, we don't have to have some of the same battles. And we have a gap in education funding, it's true. And so how are we going to fund it? Or is it just a one-year funding model or a two-year funding model? Or can we start these counts that are flowing elsewhere where it's not as needed? Do we have an opportunity to do that? And I think that certainly is one of the rubs. I mean, the speaker thinks that that's a way to do it. So I think that's appropriate to look at.
The Senate would argue that lessens transparency. Do you accept that argument?
Well, that's been one of the disagreements that I've sort of had with the legislature is we have all these pools of money around, and it's complex and it's difficult to follow, and the simplicity and transparency the Senate wants, I think that's good, but we also have to recognize that if it just all goes into the general fund and every 2 years or every year there's just a battle on where it goes, that doesn't provide some of the predictability and the stability that we hire new teachers. We hire new teachers in state and we hire new teachers out of state. We have great teachers that are currently working for us. They want to know where's this going, and certainly the public does as well. So transparency is absolutely important, and I appreciate the Senate's position on that. But I think we can provide transparency and some clarity and some predictability if we get some compromises on both sides, and that's what I'm searching for.
I think we were sitting here last year thinking that in the interim last year, this was going to be our grandest challenge. Recalibration came back, was essentially set aside. Is this still our biggest interim challenge moving forward in the last portion of your administration?
I think it is. It is the biggest challenge and so important for our state.
How do you want that to be managed?
The challenge?
Yeah.
Well, I think, as you look at some work was done last year, and I think this session, I still think we have an opportunity. We're not going to fix it this session. I mean, even if we come to, everybody agrees it's not going to be a fix, it's going to be a longer term solution. But, as we putting money, for example, into savings, as we did this year in July, and we're short on education, as we have historically put the 1% diversion into the permanent fund, I asked to have that looked at as available funds. Those are the things that we have done and will do this session, but it's not going to fix it. I mean, I think we can make a significant dent in this challenge this session.
Are you convinced or not convinced that new revenue streams are absolutely going to be critical to in the long term, solve the issue of education funding in Wyoming?
It partly depends upon, because we get 70% of our revenue from minerals. I mean, if oil, gas, coal, uranium all come back in a big way, that will change in terms of revenue needs. But I think long term we have to look at additional revenue sources, partly because if we continue to get 70% from one source, we're not diversified. And I think what we hope with Endow is, recruit companies, but we also have to have a tax structure that provides that diversification. And so, as I said in my state of state, I think it's appropriate to look at the lodging tax. I think it's appropriate to look at cigarette tax. If oil and gas come back, and I think we're really going to have a great year this year in terms of that, and even a better year after I'm out of office. But don't put those things on the side, because we'll be in the same place at some point in the future. So,
But that's been said before.
It has been said before. And so I went into the session, frankly, thinking that lodging tax and cigarette tax would be things that would have a fair look and a fair debate. They didn't go very far.
So give me an idea now. You'll still actually work on a budget again. What are your priorities now as you end your 8th year in office?
Well, we want to leave the next administration in a good place, and outside of education, on the government operations side, I think we've made good progress. It was a big deal when I made about $250 million of cuts. That put us in a pretty good place. We've also continued to reduce, as I said in my state, we have fewer employees, fewer dollars than we did 10 years ago. And so we worked on that. I want to leave the next administration in a good place on the government operations side. We unfortunately won't be able to tell the next governor that education is solved. It will take a longer term. And I certainly want, outside of the budget issues, this has been a pretty impressive session in terms of what's happening with Endow, with some of the water projects. There's a lot of good things.
Good support for your Endow initiative.
A lot of good things that are happening that they are moving forward. I understand the budget is a big issue now, but there's a lot of good things that looks like it's going to come out of this session. The legislature's done some really good work in my mind.
We've got about 4 minutes left, Governor, and there are two issues that I want to ask you about. One is tough in my eyes. Since we met last time, my wife and I went and watched the movie 3 Billboards in Ebbing, Missouri. And in that movie, there's a bigoted cop who bullies a young man, telling him to move to Cuba because they kill gays down there. And his response was, "No, you're talking about Wyoming." What will it take for Wyoming to shake that legacy, if you will, from Matthew Shepard? And does that impact the state's ability to truly recruit in your eyes? It was a stunner to me that it was said.
Here's my hope and vision for Wyoming is, before I became governor, and certainly as I was governor, Wyoming citizens, I think, are very welcoming and hospitable, despite backgrounds and different points of view. But anytime we have an incident that is, puts a label on Wyoming that was some point other than that, it points to the fact Wyoming needs to continue to work on this, because, companies that are here and companies that may move here, our neighbors or friends or uncles, we want Wyoming to be known as a state that different points of view, but we're going to judge you on your character and how hard you work and what you contribute to your family and your community and the state.
Is the state making progress there?
Well, I believe that we are. I believe we are. I think that there's been some debates that I don't think are helpful, but I think as a whole we're moving in the right direction. But I don't want to suggest that we're there, because I think it's something, not just Wyoming, but I think all states need to continue to work on. So,
last topic I think we're going to get to, Governor. 12 days you were at the White House.
12 days ago, or
yes.
I was only there for a little bit.
Yes, correct. Yeah. You had a chance to hear the president speak, interact with other governors. The president used a lot of his time talking about safety in schools, with recent events in Florida. What was your takeaway from what the president had to say, and also your interactions with other governors?
So every year we go back to the White House and we have that give and take with the president. This is the first year that that's been opened up for questions, and the press is still in the room. And I really appreciated that. That's a difficult discussion, different points of view, but I really, first of all, thought the president did a great thing by saying, let's have this discussion in public. And I also thought it was I was impressed. He said, this is the number one issue. We've got to resolve this. I think that's exactly right. Then the next step is, how do you do that? And he's, of course, expressed some ideas. Governor Rick Scott was there. Governors from other states, Governor Montana spoke about it as well. And I would just say it's sort of all over the map, except there's 100% consensus that we just don't want to continue to send our kids to school as parents, with the teachers, and wonder if it's a safe environment. And it's so changed from when I was a kid, and I think we've talked about this before. We had our rifles in our pickup trucks when we would come to school. And
I think Wyoming schools are safe.
Well, I think that as I asked the legislature several years ago for significant money to harden our schools, and we continue that, up to 10% of our school CAPCON funds go to that. I think they're getting safer. I don't think I would ever be comfortable saying that we are completely safe. I'm not going to put a target on Wyoming schools. I think it is something we've improved upon with the money we've spent hardening our schools, but I think it's something we always need to continue on. And don't come to a day, we will not declare victory on this. We have to remain diligent every day and every session to see what we can do better.
Governor Mead, it's been a pleasure again to
Thank
visit
you,
with you. Can't thank you enough for sharing your time with us in a very busy time.
Thank you for allowing us this time and get to address important topics. Great to see you.
Best wishes too, Governor,
Thanks, Greg.
as you continue
Appreciate
on.
it very much.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. And as we continue with Capital Outlook, we'll be pleased to be joined by the leadership of the Wyoming Legislature, President Eli Beebout and the Speaker of the House, Steve Harshman. Stay with us. And we begin our second segment tonight on Capital Outlook with our weekly conversation with the leaders of the Wyoming Legislature, President Eli Beebout and Speaker Steve Harshman. Gentlemen, welcome back to Capital Outlook. We've just heard from the governor. You two, there's no question, are at the epicenter of this K-12 funding debate. And Mr. Speaker, this week, let me start with you. Where are we at in those negotiations that you certainly are a significant part of? You spent a lot of time in front of the Senate Education Committee this week. Things didn't quite go your way as far as what the House was kind of trying to move forward. Where are we at as we speak?
Well, I think if you look at our overall budget, we've really had three issues the last couple of years: the general fund side, the school major maintenance with COLE's bonus going away, and then school operations because of the drop in minerals, because our schools are funded like every other state. It's property taxes primarily, and when that local property assessed valuation goes down because 70+% of the property tax paid by minerals, then the state has to step in and make up that shortfall called the state guarantee. And that's what we're struggling with, is how are we going to fund the state guarantee? And this happened in the 90s. It's called the double whammy. The locals go down, the state goes up at a time when the state has less money. So the good news is I think the general fund thing is basically solved. And we started that in the last 3 years by moving things out of the general fund. We've put things on user fees from brand inspectors and we've moved things out of the general fund that were never there that we put in. The other part really now is the state major maintenance with COLE's bonus going away. There's really no way to fund it. I think that'll be a big win for us this year. I think we're going to get that solved. And then we still have this how you fund the state guarantee. We've got $1.5 billion in savings. We're not going to do anything that's going to dramatically change. I think the thing that is stressful for people, though, is you keep hearing these sound bites and this bits and talk.
Cuts.
And people are out there listening. And I think the main thing I just want to reassure people that Wyoming is in an extremely strong position. We're going to solve a lot of this. We probably won't solve all of it. Now, we have differences. We think the House solved it last year. We think the House solved it this year. And with all due respect to the president, his no taxes has forced us to look under every rock. It has, and I think it's going to produce a better outcome in the end. And I think we'll just keep working at it.
Mr. President, big divisions yet still remain, and we're getting towards the end of this session.
Well, it is the end of the session, and of course it's called crunch time, and that happens every session, especially a budget session when you get to this point. But you know, we have a lot of opportunities and to get this thing resolved. I'm optimistic we'll come to an agreement on it. That's what it's called. It's called the process. And the Senate has been very, very strong in its anti-tax. Yet we did move forward one particular tax bill. It failed, and I understand that. So we're optimistic about what we do. And when we look at the overall picture, you know, we talk about the general fund, we talk about education, and the thing that I think you need to understand, that people need to understand on the education side, and you hear all the word cuts, the speaker mentioned cuts, we talk about that, but in reality, in the education system, the funding formula, we have escalators. And you know, escalators were justified when we had money.
Health insurance, et cetera.
Health insurance, the special ed, we cap transportation, and those are real numbers. And you know, when I look at a budget, when I look at reductions, I look at dollars on dollars. And if you bring the escalators into the foundation formula, you know, the reductions we made in spending, we're still spending more money and real dollars on education. Is that okay? Sure, if that's what the body and the legislature ultimately decides. But we just need to have that discussion. You know, these escalators cause the money to go up, and these reductions only maintain the levels that we're spending anyway. So are there any real reductions? You could have that debate, and we just need to be talking about it.
Mr. Speaker, you brought forth a modernization, if you will, of funding for K-12 education, of taking monies that the general fund hasn't necessarily seen before and maybe pushing those to education, internet sales tax, additional corporation registration fees, et cetera, that would then funnel towards education to help solve the funding side. A brief explanation, then we'll give the President a chance to say why that's not a good idea.
Well, I think if you look at all the operations of state government, and so, like corrections, and I had an analysis done on dependence on minerals, right? Corrections about 40% dependent because they get some federal funds. And then, you know, Department of Health is about 55% dependent on minerals. And then it keeps going up. And then, but the most dependent thing that we have in our state on minerals is K-12 education. It's about 82% dependent on minerals. And so we're just trying to diversify, like we're trying to do with our economy, just trying to diversify some of those streams. And I'll tell you this, little things make a big difference. And you know, a 10 million here, a reduction, a 10 million move of a revenue here, and over time, I mean, over 4 years is $40 million. And so, and I think Senator Perkins was the guy a year ago that first said, he thinks, you know, we could nickel and dime our way. And everybody I've talked to around the state, from people that run the largest industries in our state, and all of them want stability, but all of them said, just keep nibbling at this, keep working at it. And that's really what we're trying to do. And I think our idea was to look at a couple of these areas where, because all this just goes into the blob, into the general fund, nobody knows. And there's a couple areas that are growing significantly right now. One is corporate filing fees, that $50 that we pay when you start a business in Wyoming, and then internet sales tax, the state share. And so we wanted to capture a little bit of that because it wouldn't affect the general fund because it's growing so fast. And then also to have a chance to maybe capture a little more cash if we have a great year with minerals. Say oil goes up and stays up at $65 a barrel. There's going to be a lot of cash flowing to certain coffee cans in the state government. And we want to direct some of those coffee cans to build up a little cash for K-12, the state guarantee.
Diversions, if you will.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And Mr. President, we've heard the term earmarking that has been a thorn in your side relative to some of these ideas.
I respect my speaker over there, and I respect his opinion. We just disagree. You know, we think that, and I went through that before when I was in the House, and the biggest challenge we had was to get rid of earmarking and to de-earmark
Why
funds.
not set aside, this is money for education?
Because it's called transparency. And you know, when you look at the state budget, this is the big difference we have. You start with the state of Wyoming, and I think you should have the general fund and see the money that's available. Education is a huge part of that, but rather than starting to earmark now these different funds, then once you earmark those funds, you lose track of them, they automatically go there, and you'll never return them back to the general fund. So it should all go through the general fund, in my opinion. You know, we have a trouble with what we call SIPA and banking on money that may be there for construction projects. Let's build the projects, but let's wait till the money's there. Let's don't get started and try to anticipate the money being there. You know, we shouldn't realize capital gains until we realize them. So there is a difference. Now, I will agree with the speaker on major maintenance, particularly in K through 12. One of the mistakes we made, you know, years ago when we had these same kind of situations, we were broke, no money, what do? We neglected major maintenance. And that's one area, and the Speaker and I have talked about it, that I certainly would consider. If we're going to earmark anything, it would be major maintenance for K through 12. That's not going to go away. We spent over $3 billion on these schools. We need to maintain them. So, you know, in the major maintenance component, I certainly agree, but we start earmarking for education, then what about earmarking for this? And we do a lot of it now, and every time we try to change that, it's a battle. Let's put the money in the general fund. Let's be transparent about it. We won't have runaway spending. You know, that's what the process is. Let the legislators see the money that's there. And if they want to spend it, they spend it. You know, it still takes 16 votes in the Senate and 31 in the House. So we have a little disagreement on that. But, you know, there's a few things we disagree on. But at the end of the day, we'll come together.
And is that still part of the negotiation process as we speak today?
Yeah, well, I think so. And I think our committees are continuing to talk and work on these and trade proposals. I think, you know, the term earmark, I mean, I could say that that's being earmarked to the general fund, but I will say this, and I spent 10 years on the Appropriations Committee, and I'll say the last 50 years, right, from the 70s, late 60s on, and you hear out in the public coffee cans. And the reason those coffee cans are created, frankly, is because we all know, you know, you want to keep general fund revenues this much higher than general fund expenses. That's the only way the governor can control spending. Frankly, we're all big-hearted people. We're going to vote for the elderly, for little kids, and for the disabled every time those votes win. And so we've always tried to set aside money because if you create a big general fund surplus, it'll be gone, in my opinion. And I've spent 10 out of the last 50 years on the Appropriations Committee, and I've seen it. When we've had $1 billion surplus, we create new programs and spend tens of millions of dollars.
But the big difference in that we have now, and he's correct, but we had billions of dollars, we had all this money. Now we have a huge deficit. So you make it transparent, you show what's in the general fund. If there's extra money there, guess what you do with it? You reduce that deficit. And we were talking early on, and what the Speaker said, we're going to nibble away at this. Absolutely agree with him. We're not going to solve all the problems this session or last session or the next session. But as we continue to nibble away at that, one of the things we have to do is reduce that deficit. And if we put more money in the general fund, if we're able to do that, then you can use that to offset the huge deficit. That's a big issue in the Senate.
Mr. President, I need to move on to capital construction. I think that's another place that there is some division between the houses here, the House and the Senate. Mr. President, let me start with you, if I could.
I was going to have a drink of water,
okay.
But we'll start with me. Go ahead.
You bet. Much more conservative approach being offered by the Senate relative to capital construction. Where are we at in that negotiation process between you two?
We have two bills. We have 121, which is the Senate file. It's in the House. We have 194, which is the House bill in the Senate. And we took and I think we've amended our bill into the House bill. We're working on some of those issues. There's some discussion about what we want to do. I said my priorities last week. They haven't changed. Number one, the capital, it's taken care of. Number two is to deal with the state institutions, WLRC and Lander and the state hospital. Number three and four, right at the same spot, community colleges, and then the office building in Casper. Down at the bottom of my list is the science initiative. You know, we have proposals out there between the House and the Senate to try to deal with all those in a reasonable way. You know, there's some members of the Senate that say, you know, now's not the time to spend any money. Well, that's not the answer. We need to move forward, but the Senate has strong feelings about even spending any money at all.
Mr. Speaker, about 15 seconds here.
Sure. I think these things have been in the works for over 6 years. We've saved money, and here's how it's funded. On really mineral prior balance dollars, one-time dollars for these one-time projects. You do not want to put that in the general fund. Secondly, on investment income. That we've realized. So I think they're all paid for, and it's been in the works for over a half dozen years, and it's not going to get any cheaper. You wait a year, add $50 million to the price tag. Wait 2 years, add $100 million. And so I think we got to get these built for our people out there so we can serve the public better, and these things are going to last for decades. That's part of what we do. And you know, the people that built this state bonded to build the Capitol in the first place, and the university and the state hospital.
This might be our last time visiting with both of you at the same time, and I just want to
I hope not.
Be very clear. Well, in your capacities as President of the Senate and Speaker of the House, and I can't thank you both enough for being willing to take time each and every week to share your views with us. I know our viewers have appreciated your commitment and your willingness to come and visit with us.
Well, and you know, when Steve and I we co-chaired the Appropriations Committee, a Midwest kid, a Shoshone kid, small town Wyoming, but guess what? At the end of the day, there's nobody has any more passion for the state of Wyoming than Steve Harshman and Eli Beebout. and we're going to continue to do what's right. At the end of the day, we get to the end of the field, the goal line, we're going to do what's best for Wyoming. Do we have differences of opinion? Sure. But it's a healthy difference, and we're committed to this state. We're committed to the legislature, and the people of Wyoming are constituents. So it's been a pleasure to be with you and have an opportunity to have these discussions with the Speaker.
I might add, the only two leaders that I can find in any legislature in the country that don't have Facebook accounts.
And
Yeah,
I plan on changing.
I do have Twitter, but no, it's been a real pleasure to spend time with you, Craig. You've done, and your whole crew here is just a total class act, and I think Wyoming Public TV is one of the kind of wonders of Wyoming, and we really appreciate your real professionalism, your great job, and it's been really an honor.
I appreciate it.
And I hope my mother's out there watching, and
sure
also my sister, and all the public television.
If I made a mistake, I'll hear from her. I can probably guarantee.
Public television is great for Wyoming, and you've done a great job. I agree totally.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
The only man ever to be the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, Eli Bebout. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're up next now with a profile of the new Secretary of State. That's Ed Buchanan. Stay with us. And now we have a unique Capital Outlook profile with Wyoming's new Secretary of State, Secretary Ed Buchanan. Welcome to Capital Outlook. Thank you for visiting with us today.
Thanks, Craig. It's great to be here.
I would think that everyone agrees that it's unfortunate circumstances while that you're here, but you have received the appointment, so congratulations on that, and I'm sure you're excited to move forward.
Very excited about the opportunity to serve the people of the state of Wyoming.
And you told me back in our debate that that you had in 2014 that one of your goals was to really make state government more transparent.
I think there have been changes to the laws both through the legislature and the Secretary of State's office to make some aspects of Wyoming government more transparent. One of my particular focuses was to be on agency rules and regulations, and the Secretary of State's office has made that much more available to the public via online search and database. There are a few more things I'd like to see happen in that regard, but yes, I think they've made progress in that area.
You also told me in 2014 that you wanted to be an ambassador for Wyoming. And I want to ask you what that means now in the context of a different day relative to Wyoming's economy than it was then.
Well, I think being ambassador to Wyoming to me means that the Secretary of State is not the Secretary of Cheyenne. You're the Secretary of State, and it's very important for the Secretary of State to be a voice for the local communities throughout Wyoming's 23 counties. Especially as it relates to the State Loan and Investment Board, representing those counties, if you will, their projects, their needs for their local citizens, infrastructure, things like that, back in Cheyenne, and really to the legislature as well. Certainly in our current economic climate, there will be challenges. There may be less money to fund some of those projects, but the citizens of Wyoming still need a voice back in Cheyenne, and that's the role I hope to fulfill.
You said while you were campaigning for your office that it's very important to diversify our economy. And you said that we've complained for decades that our kids are leaving Wyoming and that we need to diversify our economy, and we have amended our Constitution and our laws to make that happen. Yet, it's certainly still today a struggle.
Well, as I look back, economic diversification has been a term used for decades, probably pushing 50 or 60 years.
Even when you were Speaker of the House, I'm sure.
And even before that, you can go back to governors back from the 40s and the 50s, and they actually mentioned economic diversification in their State of the State addresses. So it's nothing new. Wyoming has struggled for decades upon decades to diversify its economy. We have made changes, the Wyoming Business Council, a statutory creation. We have amended the Wyoming Constitution to give local communities the ability to add up to a quarter-cent to their local sales tax so that they can take control of their own economic destiny.
Generally, how have you been watching state government you've been in Torrington, and I'm sure you've had your eyes kind of trained here over the last couple of years. What are some issues that have really struck you?
Well, I tried to watch from afar. As you know, I got out of the legislature in 2012. Obviously, since that time, we've seen the economy somewhat stagnate, probably largely due to the decrease in the demand for coal and policies that we saw at the federal level. So I've watched that very closely, and so that brings up the issue of how do we balance, as we're constitutionally mandated, to balance the budget in a time where we have decreasing revenues. And that's probably the biggest issue that I've tried to keep an eye on since I've been gone, to see the spending policy, if you will, or the spending philosophy versus a saving philosophy in the Wyoming State Legislature. So that's one of the biggest things that is on the horizon. I think this legislature is struggling with that, especially when you have the educational funding challenges that you have right now. So that's an area that we're going to have to address long-term, sooner or later. Hopefully the economy comes back, and there are signs of that happening right now.
One of the great responsibilities your office has is to manage the integrity of elections in Wyoming. And with the current state of that question relative to whether Wyomingites, and in fact people across the country, were influenced in their decision making by foreign governments, and I'm specifically all of the talk about Russia, about how they might have tried to influence our voters. How's that weighed on your mind coming into this position here with the Secretary of State?
When it comes to influence, I think social media is really what I think about, and the focus is on that, because from what I've read and seen, you have folks being influenced perhaps from unknown sources, from unknown places. I haven't really seen anything where folks have influenced or meddled specifically in the election process itself, from a foreign government anyway, in our last election. But the influence certainly is there with the advent of social media. And I think that's going to be an ongoing concern in any country and any state in the United States.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you for carving time. You were just sworn in earlier this week, and I know that you've had a busy time here getting on board and getting going. Again, congratulations and best wishes in the rest of your service.
Thank you, Craig. I appreciate it.
And as we continue on with Capital Outlook this evening, it's our pleasure to be joined by the majority leaders of both the Senate and the House, Representative Dave Miller and Senator Drew Perkins. Gentlemen, welcome both back to Capital Outlook.
Thanks for having us, Craig.
We've heard a lot today in our show already about the state of what's going to happen with education, and I want you two to offer your views from your positions in leadership. Maybe not have been as directly involved. You certainly aren't on in the middle of all the committee work, et cetera, that's happened, but certainly it's an awfully important issue for you. Senator Perkins, what are your thoughts here as we're heading into the end of this session?
Well, I think as we talk about what's going on, I think where the Senate is and what I believe personally is that our budgeting needs to be a lot more transparent than it is. And that we need to be able to see, not only the legislation needs to be able to see and understand, but Wyoming citizens need to be able to see and understand but where all the money comes from and where all the money goes and how it gets there. I think that's important for people to understand how their tax dollars are spent. And so there's a lot of discussion and a lot of difference between the House and the Senate on the way funds flow and how things are done. I think the second thing is that as we talk about this, what people always forget that there's between $10 and $15 million per year of education funding that goes in all by itself without any legislative action. It increases, so that's
escalators.
Escalates.
We talked about that earlier in the show.
So as that happens, so even when we talk about looking at that, a lot of times as you see what happens, in a lot of respects, we're just trying to control the growth enough that it can be sustainable, because at its current rate, in a few years, even if you went and raised taxes, in a few years it would outstrip those taxes. And government spending together, which school funding is part, will just outpace our ability to keep revenues going.
Mr. Majority Floor Leader, the constituents from around Wyoming seem to think that the House has better ideas relative to education now, which in my eyes, equates to maybe fewer cuts. Where are you relative to this?
That's
debate?
where we're at. We're proposing fewer cuts, but the big difference between the Senate and the House position is the House is looking towards the future of how to fund education, and they're looking at various funding streams of the revenue streams that come to Wyoming and trying to lock some of them into future education funding so we don't repeatedly come back to this issue every year. It's still, the money is limited. We still have lots of savings, thank goodness. We've done really well for our teachers in Wyoming over the last 15 years. We were at the bottom 25% or so 15 years ago. Now we're in the top 25%. So we've done a good job. The House's position is we need to look at this stream as we go forward.
Senator, we talk about this issue of transparency. You talked about it a little while ago, and we talked about it earlier in your show. Explain to me in a little more detail why isn't it transparent that we say internet sales taxes, for example, online sales taxes are going to go to education? Why isn't it transparent to say that corporate filing fees are going to go towards education? Why is that not transparent?
And the reason it's not transparent is because those already flow to the general fund. And what you find is people do not pay attention to the school foundation funding. They pay attention to the general fund. And so by simply saying that you're going to take funding and push it off to the school foundation program, I mean, you can do that. But Craig, Wyoming has a lot of other expenditures and programs that also rise to the constitutional level, who also increase every year. Medicaid spending, care for DD waivers, those types of things, I think in the end do rise to constitutional levels because we've seen lawsuits that basically say that. So you can do that. You can go ahead and allocate money out of that would otherwise flow to the general fund to the school foundation program, but eventually you'll have the same problem on the other side of the budget. So, is it fair that we scrutinize and look at and understand everything that happens in the general fund, but we don't in the school foundation program? I don't think so. I think taxpayers need to understand it all.
Representative, that's not necessarily the House's position.
That's not the House's position. Personally, I'm one more on the conservative side, want to save money and cut government spending as a whole in many areas. But there's other issues besides education. But this has turned into the education session, and we're not addressing the fundamental deficit problems we're facing here in Wyoming, which right now are $900 million in the biennium.
All right, let's go there. We have about 2 minutes left. Both of you, I think, have started to consider important topics for the interim. Senator, let me visit with you first. What do you believe the greatest challenges is for this legislature in the interim, keeping in mind that we'll have a new administration?
I think one of the greatest challenges we have one of the things that we need to do going forward is we need to look how we do government. I think that when you look at the efficiency study and other things like that.
Moving forward,
Wyoming has to change how it does business. We've got to find the efficiencies. We've got to find the common services that we can do, eliminate that. And doing so, I think, is the equivalent of somewhere between 1 to 1.5 cents of sales tax. It's just vital that we do that. We have to come into the 21st century.
Biggest challenge in the interim, Representative Miller?
Well, to me, the number one challenge is again, back to what I talk about all the time, is the access to the public lands for mineral development, which still generates 70% of our tax base in Wyoming. There's lots of oil and gas booms going on in other states where they can get permits quickly, within weeks sometimes. And here in Wyoming, there's some operators that are waiting years to get their permits in a timely fashion. That's where our money comes from. I'm all for diversifying our economy, but we tax minerals. We don't tax what we're talking about diversifying too. I see that as an issue unless we can figure out how to tax them also.
You're talking about broadening our tax base. What discussion needs to move forward with that? In my mind, the Revenue Committee met often and produced, in the end, not a lot relative to new revenue. Is that still a discussion that you believe both needs to happen relative to potential new broadening our tax base, which may equate to new revenues for the state?
I think that's important, although I think two things need to have, before you go back and ask the taxpayers to open up their wallets. I think two things need to happen. Is one, I think Dave is absolutely right that we've got to remember the girl we brought to the dance, and that's been minerals. And we have to provide incentive and opportunity for minerals to continue to fund to grow our economy, because it's an integral part of our economy, and we hope to keep that going for a long time. So I think that's part of it.
Senator, let me ask you a question. I remember the discussion relative to capital construction bill to the office building in Casper. And the Senate's position was, well, let's maybe wait, and then on 2 different days is maybe we'll have a few more oil wells next year that will help maybe give us some more money to carry on with that project. Yet we hear this discussion, we need to diversify and not be so dependent upon minerals. Are we ever going to be able to do that? Real quick, and then we'll have about a minute left, Representative. Let me have you take that now.
Well, it's real simple. You know, I don't think we need to raise anyone's taxes. Minerals can continue to pay the bills in perpetuity, but you have to allow access, number one. Number two, thank goodness for the minerals where we built up these reserves over the last decade and a half, and we're spending some of those reserves right now. And frankly, I'm not willing to raise anyone's taxes until our savings have been used up. Then we can look at diversifying the tax base. But again, minerals can pay the bills forever, but you have to allow access.
Senator Perkins, you have about 15 seconds if you want to bring it home.
I don't necessarily disagree with Dave, but the other side of it is you've got to have government working at a streamlined and efficient rate. Otherwise, people will just believe they're throwing their money away.
Well, both Majority Floor Leaders, Representative Dave Miller and Senator Drew Perkins, thank you so much for being available to us this morning, and best wishes here as we get through crunch time here in the budget session of the Wyoming Legislature.
We're winding up. Thank you, Craig.
You're sure welcome. Up next is a discussion with the more conservative right of the Wyoming House. We'll visit with Representative Bo Beitman and Representative Chuck Gray. That's next on Capitol Outlook. Stay with us. And now for our final segment of Capitol Outlook, we're with two of the more conservative members of the Wyoming House, Representative Chuck Gray and Representative Bo Beitman. Both of you, welcome to Capitol Outlook. We're glad you're here this morning.
Thank you for having us.
You bet. Craig. For both of you, this is your first budget session. Yeah. And Bo, let me start with you. You've got a budget you're going to have to vote on here in a little while. Right now, is this a budget that you can support?
We'll see. Probably not right now at the moment. I didn't vote for it as it left the House. We'll see what the Senate and the House come together and come up with, but as of right now, probably not.
And just briefly, why? Why not?
A little too much spending for my taste. I came down here with high hopes of getting our government down to a more manageable size on the spending side. I don't think we've done it quite yet. I'm glad we didn't raise taxes. That's a great thing, but we still haven't quite tackled the spending issue. And we've got some issues with education that I don't think we've dealt with yet.
We're going to dive into both of those topics here just a little more, but Chuck, on the surface, you've been very vocal in the House about this budget.
Yeah, I didn't vote for it when it came around for the final vote. Obviously, they're in conference committee, and we'll see what they come out with. But this is the general fund budget, so it's for general fund expenditure. And there is just so much room for reduction. I mean, this budget has more pork than a breakfast fast food drive-up. You look at this bailout for a private school. You look at, I brought an amendment to cut our central motor vehicle pool by 5%. To reduce the governor's office by 3 positions. It's more than doubled here over the last decade. Ultimately, we're able to get a 1 position reduction on that. But you look at the growth of 900 series, which is contractual series. That's when agencies go out and contract out with outside entities. I mean, there's just so much room for us to look at spending, and I don't think we've done enough of that.
Now, the governor told us in his State of the State address that his budget's in fact $400 million less than what it was 10 years ago.
You look at the actual expenditure and you get down in that budget and you see the room for reduction. And so that's the reality. And I've talked to my constituents and they see a lot of room for us to make government more efficient. And that's the bottom line.
We hear that a lot. And then you get down to the nitty-gritty and ask folks, give me specifics. You've mentioned a couple, Representative Gray, Representative Beitman. What are those things? You know, that we can all say there's pork, we can all say there's room for cuts, but when we get down to it, then all of a sudden it gets a little more specific.
Well, Representative Gray and I, we've ran amendments to the budget to eliminate vacant full-time positions that are unfilled at the moment, and those failed. That's an example right there of efficiencies. The motor pool example, different things, you know, we can, there's plenty of ways, like he said, in the general fund where we can trim the fat. We just haven't done it yet.
Have either of you supported the effort in the government efficiency effort with Representative McGuire and Senator Perkins that are pushing forward? What are your thoughts about that? You're going to have to spend some money to save some money, is what it looks like to me.
Well, and the design of that is very important, because my feeling is that the consultants and the folks that are helping to bring that about should, rather than be paid a flat fee, it should be tied to actually getting results. And that's a discussion that we've had on the floor as well, because I am concerned that if it's just a flat fee, the incentives aren't going to be there to actually have the efficiencies. And as you've seen, Craig, you were talking about this earlier, I mean, when the proposals are actually brought to the floor, it becomes very difficult to put together enough votes to get success. So I think it does need to be tied to success, but the effort is absolutely 100% spot on.
We've, all right, I've heard you both question transparency of this process and the idea of maybe there's a better way that this budget can be created. For those of us who are here and spend our time listening to the Joint Appropriations Committee in December and in January, going through the whole budget line by line with opportunities for public comment, you could argue that it is very open. Do you agree with that? Representative Gray, I'll start with you.
Well, what we've been talking about, there was a bill from Representative Jennings, and ultimately that bill was not heard. That was very unfortunate, which would have said that the state checkbook, there needs to be a certain amount of time where that state checkbook is going to be returned if it's asked for. Right now in state statute, there is an open-ended date for agencies to return requests for transparency, requests for expenditure. So, you know, you talked a little bit about the legislative process, but what we've been looking at a lot as well is the expenditures themselves. When individuals want to see those expenditures, see the checkbook, and openthebooks.com came here in Wyoming because our state ranks number 50 for transparency in the union, and the state auditor has refused to turn over portions of that state checkbook, and that's problematic.
Just real briefly, do you think that's a technology issue that's going to resolve itself, or do you think it's something different?
Hard to say. I mean, I think we fix statute and it fixes it, and that was what the bill does. I mean, whether there's something deeper there, you fix statute though, then it needs to get done, and it will get done.
Speaking of where Wyoming ranks on surveys, I want to ask you about Wyoming's economy. U.S. News and World Report came out with their rankings this week about where states fit. And as you can imagine, Wyoming was on the bottom, not 50th, but 47th with its current economy, in the land of a wonderful tax structure to theoretically attract business. Why hasn't the great tax structure that Wyoming has today fueled Wyoming's economy to make it better than it is? Do we know?
It's a good question. A lot of it probably has to do with the fact that we're probably the most remote place in the lower 48 states. You got to want to live here, and you got to want to have that ruggedness and kind of off the grid feeling to live in Wyoming. And you know, it doesn't attract everybody. I mean, there's going to be CEOs and executives whose wives probably don't want to move to certain places of Wyoming because they don't have the nightlife or the shopping or things like that. But we are blessed with an embarrassment of riches with oil, gas, and coal and natural resources and natural beauty for tourism and things like that.
But you hear and hear and hear, we have to diversify.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little about that. Yeah. I have an economics background. It's one thing I'm really passionate about and studied. And the reality is you study a lot of the diversification stories around our country, state by state. And what happened was agglomeration economies built in certain areas of certain states. And that's what we need to be looking for in the state of Wyoming. And you study those case studies in Oklahoma, it wasn't government spending that did it. It was low tax structure and a government that was efficient, lean, delivered the core services that government is responsible for and kept it at that.
So
and this idea that
again,
somehow,
Representative Gray, I go back that Wyoming has the third highest dependency in that other tax category, which includes severance taxes, the mineral industry. And our taxes are low. We do develop, in my opinion, offer these core services. Why hasn't that translated yet? Is it the remoteness or is it something else?
Well, the thing we need is those agglomeration economies. And it's not increasing taxes. That's not going to be the answer. I can assure you that. That's going to hurt it. That's the number one thing you could do to hurt it, is increasing taxes. And unfortunately, right now, we've got this idea that, well, and we see it a lot in the state legislature, that, well, it's government that is going to somehow be the answer, and that somehow this could be paid for with increasing tax, and that's going to push us over the top. And we haven't seen a single case study that has confirmed that. In fact, they've been doing this now for multiple decades. And by definition, in them identifying that it hasn't happened, they've admitted that the strategy hasn't worked.
We have about 30 seconds. Briefly, school K-12 funding. It's in a deficit for sure. What's the answer? More cuts there?
We got to look at the cost side and try to control the cost as much as possible.
Representative Gray, I'll give you the last word.
One thing I would say on that is I think we really need to control the general fund. And you look at past bienniums when we've had deficits in schools. What is the first thing that past legislators have done? They've looked at the general fund for efficiencies, for the general expenditures of government. And that's one thing that the conservatives have really tried to do with our central motor vehicle pool amendments, identifying agencies, vacant positions that should be reduced. And that's really, the efficiency study, that's really where we really need to look.
Well, Representative Gray and Representative Beitman, it's been fascinating for me to watch both of you as freshman legislators become impactful to this wider legislature, and I appreciate your time here with us this morning.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for joining us. So that's a wrap for Capital Outlook 2018, the budget session of the Wyoming legislature. Maybe. There's a lot up in the air. This legislature, as we speak, earlier in the week, doesn't know when it's going to gavel out, if you will. So we'll continue to follow the legislature from here in Cheyenne. It's been our privilege to bring this show to you each Friday. From all of us at Wyoming PBS, from all of the videographers and the editors who come to Cheyenne each and every week, we appreciate their work. I'm Craig Blumenshine. Thank you for joining us.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.